All work and no hockey makes Brad a dull boy. All work and no hockey makes clean hits dull boys. Hey, feels like it's been forever since the Utah Hockey Club beat the Washington Capitals in a shootout overtime win. By the way, I was talking to a buddy just yesterday about Dylan Gunther's almost three overtime goals, because that one at during the Capitals game where he was cruising down the ice and he just clearly didn't realize he didn't have enough time to make the shot. Oh, if he had only known and released that shot earlier, that could have been 3 out of 4 games with an overtime winning goal. Anyways, Four Nations Faceoff is kicked off, which means there are no NHL games until February 22nd. The Four Nations have been pretty fun. I thought that Canada-Sweden game really was kind of nearly Olympic level in quality. The U.S. absolutely spanked Finland last night. A little bit different, but the Tkachuk brothers playing on the same line was an absolute spectacle. It was like two mean, nasty Sedines reading each other's mind, but their hair is curly and not red. I loved it. A+ entertainment. Great job by the league to replace the All-Star game with this, in my opinion. But we're not here to talk about that, because more importantly, if you are a diehard Utah Hockey Club fan, an important date is coming up, and that is March 7th, which is the trade deadline. So today, the Clean Hits crew is going to talk all about the different options the team could take. Are they going to be buyers? Are they going to be sellers? What would that look like? And then more importantly, if they make these moves, if they go down those routes, what does this look like in the offseason? We love speculating. I know you do too. That's why you are here. You are here to hear speculation on trades, potential free agent signings, potential offer sheets. Yes, we use the OS word. We are here. We are all about it. This is the Clean Hits Hockey Podcast. I am your host, Brad. We got Kenny. We got Trent. We got Corey. We got everybody here. How you guys doing?
Good. Speaking
Living
of
the dream.
Yeah.
Speaking of speculating, I'm speculating on whether I'm in hot water or not, because I completely forgot today was Valentine's Day. So
Oh no.
might be getting some 7-Eleven chocolate covered strawberries and put them out on a little tray.
Yeah. If you go cold and your video cuts out and your audio's gone, if you don't hear from Kenny for the last third of this episode, you know where he is gone.
Yeah.
Otherwise, some other interesting news for Clean Hits. I don't know if you see this awesome Mammoth Club shirt I am wearing. We have dropped our support for the most important vote in Salt Lake City and Utah right now for the team name. We are all aboard on Mammoth. You can see it on the screen right now if you're watching on YouTube. The Mammoth Club shirts are at our store. We got a couple different colors. We even went as far as making hoodies in them. They look awesome. They fit great. Love the color coordination with kind of the team colors. There may be a little nod to another famous NHL logo there, and you can get your own at shop.cleanhitshockey.com. Again, that's shop.cleanhitshockey.com. Show your support for the only team name that matters, in my opinion, and showing your support for Clean Hits, doing two things at once, is the way to go. Trust me, I believe in that very much so. Anyways, any other housekeeping, guys? Oh, you may have also noticed we finally hit that mark of being a supported YouTube partner. Thank you for all the subscribers. Thank you for everybody who's left comments, subbed, interacted, liked. That all helps. That all helps us keep kind of the lights going, and maybe down the road some better equipment, some new video editing stuff, some cool things down the road. But you may have noticed there is a little way to say thanks, or we have some memberships now at, I believe it's $1.99 a month. You can get some cool badges. You get the super chat, super comments, and all that fun stuff. And not only that, but you'll have access to our very own Club Mammoth at our Discord, which you can get at discord.cleanhitshockey.com. And that is another fantastic Utah Hockey Club community. You can chat with a bunch of people. We have over 200 members. Our game day threads are insane. We share the memes. We talk about prospects in there. Anything you could possibly want to become a complete obsessive Utah Hockey Club or Utah Mammoths fan is at your fingertips there. Again, discord.cleanhitshockey.com. And if you want access to that special Club Mammoth section in the Discord where you can chat with us and kind of help us come up with things like interview questions with the players, content ideas for podcasts, all you need to do is do that super membership follow on the YouTube channel. So that is the house cleaning. Time to talk about the important stuff. So as of today, as of the Four Nations break, the Utah Hockey Club has played 56 games. They have 57 points with a record of 24 wins, 23 losses, and 9 overtime losses. This puts them in a spot where they are 6 points out of a wild card spot, the lowest wild card spot held by Vancouver, and 8 points out from the lowest. Oh, wait, we're Central. It's the old Yotes fan of me. I'm looking at LA.
Yep.
We are 15 points away from the lowest spot in the Central. So really, if the Utah Hockey Club makes it into the playoffs, it seems like that route is that last wild card spot, which again, 6 points out of, and they're 3 points behind the Calgary Flames, who are kind of sitting on the outside looking in. Of course, this means there's no really defined way of what this team is going to do for the trade deadline. Are they going to be buyers? Are they going to be sellers? Maybe a little bit of both. And again, we are here to talk about it. So we're going to kick it off with what I think is the easiest route to define, and that would be the team selling. And I think we can all agree here that we are not going to be selling, Logan Cooley, Dylan Guenthers, Clayton Kellers, all those big names, Sergachev, obviously. Those are all guys who are probably pretty much untouchable at this point. I think what makes the most sense is obviously selling some upcoming UFAs, Ian Cole being probably the biggest name of the bunch. Alexander Kerfoot has to be up there, and Nick Bukestad. So all three of those guys I could see potentially being moved out, and realistically, we're probably talking about a third-round pick coming back, so maybe later round picks, maybe even kind of some AHL-style depth players, but probably nothing really groundbreaking here. But one of the important things here is how that would open roster spots for some of those younger players in the AHL to kind of move on up and kind of show their stuff on the big league. Any thoughts on those names I've listed, on the returns, maybe teams that may be a good fit? Honestly, all three of those players, I think any team would take. We're talking about some nice depth at center, wing with Kerfoot, who can slide to C. Right now, he's playing top line center with Nick Schmaltz and Clayton Keller. So optionality there. And Ian Cole, I think, is a proven playoff warrior, cup winner. Feels like he goes to a playoff team every single year. So I feel like anyone would be interested.
Yeah, I think that Kerfoot is probably the most intriguing name on our roster of available players. Just due to the fact that he is so versatile, you can slide him anywhere in your lineup. He is a low end second line player, a high end fourth line player. His hockey IQ is off the charts. He's a big Harvard guy. I don't know if we've covered that before, but no, he's a workhorse. He's a Swiss Army knife, very respected and well liked in the room. I could see a lot of Sooners lining up for him, and it would hurt to lose him. I've really enjoyed him here, but I mean, if you're in a spot where you're not entirely sure, it's not a slam dunk that you are going to be fighting till the last game for that wild card spot, you have to entertain on players like Kerfoot, just because the long-term fit probably isn't with Utah.
I think to me, the player that's... No, you go ahead. Yeah, I think that's a great point on Kerfoot about being sad to see him go, right? But we've been in a position in the past where we've dealt a pending UFA that we would have preferred to keep in Nick Bjugstad, and we dealt him to Edmonton in a trade that, as part of the package, returned Michael Kesselring to the team. So that's been an absolute boon of a trade for GMBA. But in addition to that, we liked him so much that when we approached him over the summer, he was willing to re-sign with the team. So a player like Alex Kerfoot, who I think provides a ton of value, especially on a rebuilding team, given that he is that Swiss Army knife that can play up and down the lineup, any position, provide leadership and solid play in all three zones, that might be a guy that you look to trade to get some value back. And then come free agent day, see if he's interested in returning to a familiar situation, a familiar role, and see if maybe you can't retain his services at that time.
And to me, I think the most interesting piece to move at the deadline is Ian Cole. Leads the league in block shots, 149. You're trying to make a cup run. You generally need about 10 defensemen deep to make a long run. Ian Cole's made the playoffs. I think it's around 10 years in a row. He won a Stanley Cup. His cap number is pretty low. And I wouldn't be surprised if when we signed him, we made some kind of deal where, hey, come to Utah for a year, help us out. If we make the playoffs, great. And if not, we'll get you on a team that's going to make a playoff run. I think we did that last year as well with sending Dumba to Tampa and Jason Zucker to Nashville. And those two guys got to play in the playoffs when Arizona missed. So I wouldn't be surprised if the same deal is on the table for Ian Cole this year. And you look at, some of the pieces that are moving already. Cody Ceci got a fourth. If you go back to last year's deadline, Dallas gave up a pretty good pile to get Chris Tanev out of Calgary, and I think that could be a good comparable for what Ian Cole could get this year. And I think the other thing with Ian Cole is he's done a good job this year, but we're not going to bring him back just based on his age and based on some of the other defensemen we have coming up. We just don't have a spot for him going ahead.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that his value probably lands right in the middle of Tanev and CC. And I think a second round pick, when at first you mentioned that, Corey, I thought was a little bit pie in the sky. Having looked at the comps, I think that is possible. Now, part of me says, I like Ian Cole. And I like when the team is competitive, and we've got enough second round picks. We've got too many second round picks. We've used too many second round picks. We already are running out of room for these guys. And we'll touch on that when we talk about Tucson shortly. But here's a thought. As much as a second round pick is great value for Ian Cole, and conflicting with that, how little I really give a crap about second round picks, honestly, at this point. There's one thing to consider here. Second round picks are never worth less than they are at the trade deadline. Second round picks are never worth more than they are at the entry draft. So if we're just acquiring liquid assets to turn around and flip, now's the time to buy low, and the draft is the time to sell high on those assets. We just saw the Vancouver Canucks take back a first round pick for JT Miller, which they immediately flipped for Marcus Pettersson. So those draft picks are nice and liquid. They're easy to flip for other pieces. And that may be a very good reason why we want to get some picks while we can for Kerfoot, for Bjugstad, and for Cole to help fill the coffers even more, to pull the trigger on some bigger deals at the draft that set us up for more success next season and beyond, and frankly, make us an even more appealing destination for a guy like Alex Kerfoot to want to return to.
Yeah, I think if you look back at the Sergachev deal, we gave up the 4 pieces, right? We gave up JJ Moser, we gave up Connor Geeky, we gave up a second, and we gave up a 7th. That looks a lot different if you think of it as if we gave up Geeky, Moser, Ian Cole, and a 7th, right? It's basically a free pick, so do it.
I gotta ask, was that 7th acquired from the OEL Garland trade? Remember, it was all this pile of stuff with the cherry on top being like a 7th round pick 3 years later. I'm gonna have to look that up too, because
there was
hilarious to think that
there was a stretch of trades.
Slowly,
yeah.
I gotta look at that.
And there was a stretch of trades where Bill Armstrong would ensure that he would get a 7th round pick from everybody in every deal. Just
now you see why.
Cherry on top. Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, having said that, I got one question. We talked about whether we thought Alex Kerfoot was the most appealing piece at the deadline or whether it was Ian Cole. I think you could go back and forth on that in terms of what the market will bear, but I don't think it's either one of them personally. I think the most appealing pending UFA that could be made available at the deadline is one we didn't bring up. And would be the one that I think would ruffle the most feathers, cause the most elevated heart rates around SLC, and get the fan base really stirred up. And that is Karel Vejmelka. Now, if this team is going to lose their next couple of games, and they're going to limp right into that trade deadline well out of it, and they've got Karel Vejmelka due a big raise, whose track record, let's face it, has been inconsistent, albeit very good so far in Utah. We've seen him be good in stretches before and follow that up with some cold streaks. Is this the guy they want to hang their hat on and hang their playoff hopes on for next season? Or are there some other options on the market they might want to look at? And once again, take a cold, logical look at extracting the most value at the right time that they can flip later. What do you guys think about the concept of making Karel Vejmelka available to the market?
I hate the optics. I hate the idea. I love the concept. I don't know if that makes sense, because it just, if you think about it, Vejmelka, I have become a Vejmelka believer. And he seems just like a great, genuine guy. He seems to love Utah. But he's on an insanely good contract. His numbers have always been higher than expected, especially when he was playing on a Coyotes team that was pretty abysmal. He got to the point where he had multiple suitors for 2 years in a row, and it would be a tough pill to swallow. I agree with that, Trent. I didn't even think about that, but I absolutely would not be surprised if say the worst case scenario happens and we go on a string of losses here in the next couple weeks before the deadline. I would not be surprised if teams are calling us about Vejmelka. And unfortunately, in those instances, you got to strike when the iron's hot.
I think I'd almost be more inclined to keep him and just till July 1st. And if he walks, because if he goes, I don't know who our goalie is otherwise. And I think part of the challenge of dealing with at the deadline is no one really in a playoff position needs a goalie. Maybe Carolina, but they have Freddie Anderson, and they've been linked to John Gibson forever. So, like, if there's no market and there's only one potential buyer and they're offering a third-round pick, do you just hang on to him and just, if you lose them, you lose them? And I mean, hey, you still get the next, 2-3 months to try and figure out a contract. So
I feel like Edmonton would take a flyer on him.
True. They could use some experience back there. Let me ask you this, Brad. Assuming a somewhat decent return, and assuming you're a little bit on the fence about whether or not you want to deal Vejmelka at the deadline, is there another single piece that you could deal that doesn't necessarily hurt the team in the long term, as Vejmelka is probably not the long-term solution in goal, that would more drastically improve your draft position in what is hopefully the last draft in which you're going to be picking very early? Is there a more draft position accelerating deal than Karel Vejmelka for a second-round pick? You're on mute, Brad.
I would hope that would be more than a second-round pick, because there are 32 hockey teams now, and there are about 2 teams who are starting guys that probably wouldn't be sniffing the league, or at least have 2 backups that wouldn't be sniffing the league a couple years ago. If any of the teams that are currently in a playoff spot lose a goaltender, then you got to think his stock skyrockets. Gibson's a name that's out there, but Vejmelka's cap hit is pretty much a blip. Looking kind of at the standings, I think Columbus would probably be interested as an upgrade or have a true tandem then. Detroit's goaltending is still kind of a carousel, and maybe we can get a vet plus a young goaltender back in that situation. And then another name that pops out is funny. They're all kind of in the East, but Florida has a $4 million backup right now who is young, and Florida also is in a spot where they may need to shed some cap next season. Now, granted, Vejmelka would probably be asking for 4+, as a UFA, but maybe that's a situation where more and more dominoes fall.
It's like a kick the can down the road scenario for them.
Yep.
Yeah,
but
I can see that.
Kind of go with your point. Yeah, that sure would probably tank the team down a little bit more. But Ingram's played very well since he's been back. So I think if you have at least a decent enough backup, you can stop the bleeding from a trade like that, even though you may lose a couple extra games than you would have had you kept Vejmelka.
What does it do for the optics for not only the players but management and ownership if you deal Vejmelka for a draft pick?
I don't think it looks good.
I don't think it does either, especially since we're in the thick of it. Depends on when you trade him, right? I mean, I feel like if you wait till trade deadline and that 6 points that we're behind Vancouver suddenly, I mean, we've got a couple games coming up against Vancouver. Those could be big swings. Those could be 4-point swings there. So I think that if we're firmly out of the chase, I think it makes more sense. But if we're still in the single digits behind Vancouver, it's going to be a tough sell, especially since he's solidified himself as the number one goalie. But he is a UFA, and it's
and he's not necessarily the guy you want to sign long term or to big money. And yet he's certainly earned himself quite a raise. Now, I think that was a really interesting concept you proposed, Brad, down in Florida, where maybe Spencer Knight doesn't make the most sense for them in the next couple of years, and he would make a whole heck of a lot of sense for us over here in Utah. I think that Spencer Knight would be a mammoth addition to the future of the goaltending position here in Utah. And boy, it would be interesting to see what sorts of other veterans and what combinations of salary retentions and what other sort of value adds we could bring to the table to make that swap make sense for the Ice Cats down there in South Beach.
Yeah.
I like that idea of like a hybrid buying and selling, because that's what Bill Armstrong does. Like he's a realistic person, but he also wants to send a message to the people like, hey, this rebuild is almost complete. We've been doing it for years. I warned you in the beginning, this is going to take a while, but we're going to stack good player on top of good player on top of good player. And we're going to be a competitive team. And the fact that we're even near the playoffs this year, has shown that we've been on that trajectory. So that's an interesting one, Brad. I hadn't thought of that. I've always been a Spencer Knight fan, and you could imagine that if Florida wants to go again on another deep run, that they would look for an experienced backup and one that's got great numbers on a great contract. So it's interesting.
Well, we'll get into this a little bit too when we start to talk about the off season, but Florida's got an Aaron Ekblad to re-sign and a Sam Bennett to re-sign, plus a lot of depth guys, and $14 million on your goaltending seems like a lot. So it may even give them some of that wiggle room to maybe find a suitor for Bob for a year if they can really trust Vejmelka, or they would only have one more season of Bob after that. So they could maybe get Vejmelka signed long term at the same price that Knight is, which is 4.5, and then find a kind of another cheaper option like a Talbot or one of those kind of tandem guys that you could run with Vejmelka. But we will get more into the offseason and kind of some of those moving parts in a little bit here. Two other pieces that are some names that would kind of make sense on the selling component, and they're some fan favorites here, but you have to take a critical eye to them, and that would probably be Lawson Krause and Matthias Michelli, who are both having down years. Again, I don't think this would be a trade if they were to move these players to just get picks, though. I think this would be that situation where they're almost using them to buy, which I don't know if you just noticed the alley-oop I gave to myself. So let's transition right into the buyer's standpoint here.
Right.
And let's keep those two names in mind as maybe pieces that you can use to upgrade, because I think if this team is buying, they're mostly looking for long-term pieces to help them not only for maybe a run this season, but to improve that roster at least for another season or two. Kenny, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you wouldn't mind, I might interject and before we move over to the buying side, I would say one other name to look out for potentially that we would be selling is like a Michael Carconi type.
Oh yeah,
Just
that's true.
due to the fact that he's shown that he can put up goals in for cheap, and much like Krause and Michelli, who we're about to talk to in a potential buying trade, but we'd be selling them. They've all sat out games this year, so it's hard not to address the elephant in the room. So I would
mammoth in the room.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How did I speaking of alley oops, how did I miss that one? But Austin Facer's out there punching air right now. With the missed opportunities that I got. But no, I definitely think that that's a name that you could realistically, I don't want to say almost certainly, but if we are selling off pieces, you probably see him moved for depth scoring somewhere. But go ahead. I wanted you to continue on.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off that, it's the importance of the roster spots right now for this team. Right now, there are some depth pieces in Tucson. Yamamoto, favorite to have made the team out of training camp, is kind of stuck in the AHL because of how many forwards this team has. Josh Doan is currently up and making a case to not get sent back down, but once Cooley is healthy, that means you're potentially sitting both Liam O'Brien and Michael Carconi every single night, or rotating out Matthias Michelli and Lawson Krause. Then there are other players like Sokolov, who is a friend of the show, and we would love to get an opportunity. And I'm sure that trade was due in part because he would provide some scoring depth and winger depth in case of mass injuries, and we haven't been able to even see what he can do at the NHL level. So when we're thinking of this team as a buyer, I don't think it is to buy a Michael Carconi or an Ian Cole or a Nick Bjugstad, a rental, as they will, that those players would offer a contending team. I think if anything, it's going to be a short to long-term improvement. So if I'm going to make some buckets here to throw some names into, a Dylan Cousins would be a long-term solution down the middle, either at 2C or 3C. That would probably require a roster player like Michelli, Krause, Kesselring, which we, out of the blue, have an abundance of right defensemen now, plus some prospects and picks to acquire. But that is an upgrade of certain roster spots. A Braden Shen would be more in that kind of short-term kind of piece where we are acquiring a guy who can play 2C, second line center, but he's a little bit older and maybe more equipped to be a very good two-way 3C as soon as next season or the season after that. But that still brings a vet presence. It's kind of an upgrade of Nick Bjugstad's role, allows Barrett Hayton to potentially play on that third line or pivot back up to 2C. It just gives strong center depth up and down the lineup. And a player like that, again, would probably require some roster pieces that are on the younger side for the Blues. So maybe a Michelli going back, a Krause going back, again, maybe a Kesselring, but the price probably wouldn't be as much as Cousins. And the reason why we bring up Chen is Darren Dredger did make comment that it would require a quote unquote mammoth, we've said that so many times today, return to acquire him. And I don't know if that was him literally winking at the screen or was just a poor choice of words, but it made our ears perk up. And I do think that that 2C spot is really where we're the weakest right now. And down the road, if we're going to have Bjugstad walk, we're going to need to address center in some capacity. So those are kind of the first two names I can think of that may be available in the next couple of weeks that would be a nice upgrade to the roster. Other names and ideas that you guys have been poking around or seeing, or maybe have been hearing even?
I would throw out the name, talking about friend of the show, Brogan Houston mentioned the name Kirby Dach out of Montreal. Really struggled this year, right? Had the injury last year, missed all kinds of time. Probably came into the NHL too early with Chicago and still kind of looking for that breakout year. But, checks a lot of the boxes. I've talked a lot about getting a second line center who kind of balances Cooley, who Cooley's a little bit smaller, but if you can get a second line center who's a little bit bigger, Kirby Dach is 6'4". He's a big guy. He's okay on the draw, but that could be an interesting project, and he might be potentially a cheaper ad than if you got to pay a pile for Dylan Cousins. You might be able to get Kirby Dach for a little bit cheaper, with the risk that it just might not work out here either.
There's another buy low candidate whose star once shone even brighter than Kirby Dach's and is certainly on the trade market. It's no secret at all. This is a bit of a fixer-upper. Do you think you can be the team to save him? And that's Trevor Zegras. I think that Trevor Zegras is an interesting name in terms of upside. He has not yet played in the way that we typically associate with how Bill Armstrong likes to see core players on this team play. But he's in a pretty bad situation in Anaheim. It's no secret that everybody there does not like playing for their coach, or at least that's the widespread rumor du jour. And prior to Cronin, they had Eakins, who's infamously difficult to play for. They've had the types of squads that have been picking top, 2 to 6 for years and years in a row now at this point. It hasn't really been a great situation for Trevor Zegras to thrive. And we have seen players come to this team and evolve their game. Did you think 4 years ago there was going to be a chance that Keller could play the type of game we see Keller play now, where he's constantly attacking the middle, where he's playing with his heart on his sleeve, where he's clutch, where he's got grit? We saw stuff like that from Trevor Zegras before he entered the NHL. We did. He's got enough fire in his belly, I think, that he might surprise some people. But obviously, you guys all sighed for a reason when I brought up his name. There's a ton of red flags there as well. I mean, he might be the biggest red flag in the league, but an interesting, definitely available buy low candidate that fits right in the age range. What do you guys think now that I've talked for 9 straight minutes about a player I don't like?
You changed my mind mid thought there. I think you're at the 4-minute and 30-second mark when you were speaking. No, I'm just teasing you. I speak a lot too. But when you brought up the Keller situation, Keller did kind of remind me earlier on, like he's a super skilled winger that I didn't necessarily see as like a bona fide playoff performer. Now we look at Keller and he's got a bloodied up face and he's still going hard in the corners and winning puck battles along the boards. I can see Keller being an absolute menace in the playoffs. So when you initially brought up Zegras, I sighed. Obviously there's history there. It goes back to the days of the Coyotes, but it's water under the bridge now. I'm intrigued by it. I mean, he's a 60-point player, or has been. And I don't think that I think you're 100% right. He definitely is one of those change of scenery candidates, especially under the coaching staff there. And I'd be intrigued. I also don't know how sold I am on the idea just based off of the track record. But I mean, it depends on the cost. I wouldn't say a hard no. It just I'm not giving up prime assets for Trevor Zegras.
Well, let me ask you this question, Brad. Can you think of a better mentor for him than Clayton Keller?
Oof. I am so opposed to this idea that I'm having a hard time not thinking of it in a biased manner. But I guess my problem, though, is he is more of a winger than a center. And we have the likes of Daniil Boot and Mr. Tisha Ginla still coming up the pipelines. And at some point here, you need power play time. And we're seeing that issue with Matthias Michelli, and probably one of the only reasons why we're even saying his name as a potential piece to bring in an upgrade for. And if we can't give someone like Trevor Zegras top power play unit time, let alone he would definitely be on the second unit. I'm not even going to say that he wouldn't. But our top power play unit is now starting to play way over the average time of a top power play unit. I mean, it feels rare to see the second unit come out if the first unit starts, unless there is some sort of loss of possession, right? After like a minute and a half.
Yeah.
They want Gunther and Keller on the ice for as much of the 2-minute power play time as they can get. And between Zegras' injuries, his mouth,
baggage,
and
the
baggage, and the potential to not log the type of minutes he would need to excel here, it's too big of a red flag for me to commit to moving any sort of assets for. So that's my flag.
Yeah. When I think of Zegras, you think of like roster construction and how the players fit, not just as hockey players, but in the locker room and things like that. We've heard Bill Armstrong's philosophy on this in the past, talking about no dirt bags. But I do think of another philosophy that around the league. If you go back to the training camp in New Jersey, the general manager of the Devils, Tom Fitzgerald, had a rule of no dickheads. And I think that applies here with Trevor Zegras.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, here's a guy who's similarly built physically, has some warts himself, but I think it's certainly much more well-rounded, much more well-liked, and probably passes the dickhead test. And that is a guy who's a little underappreciated right now too, which is Casey Middlestat.
I knew it.
Gosh.
You know what though?
This is why you're in sales, man. You butted us. You gave us the real bad option first, and then said, "Here's the other crappy one, but you'll like it more than the first one."
Yeah.
Hey, I got a 30% off that expires at the end of the month.
Trent's been beating this drum since December, and rightfully so. Casey Middlestat had, there was a turnaround there, and he started to show some promise again. I mean, you don't get moved for Bowen Byram if you don't have some promise there, and that trade ended up looking like a blockbuster at the time, and it just hasn't worked out for either team. I don't know. I'm not trying to quickly pivot off of this. I want you guys to, give your thoughts on Casey Middlestat too. But if we're going for a center in that age range, I would much rather have like a Trent Frederick from Boston, where you're getting. I don't know, Frederick's numbers aren't great this year, but you're getting like I would say consistent 40-point score, and that has more tools in the toolbox than Casey Middlestat does. But I don't hate the idea of Middlestat as much as I did in December. I'll give Trent that.
Well, listen, Frederick plays mostly wing, and he's a UFA. I like him too, though, not just because he's got a great name. Now, with Middlestat, it feels weird to be hard selling Middlestat. I'm not a huge fan. I like that. I do think he plays with good effort. I think that he's physically not very strong, and he's not a great skater for somebody who is not physically imposing. But I think he has good defensive instincts, a good head for the game, a decent motor, and pretty darn good skills. But I'm thinking about Colorado. They just dealt a big old monster of a player in Mikko Rantanen for not a very large player in Martin Necas. And I do wonder if they wouldn't like to get some muscle in the lineup, some size on the wing that they're missing from the Rantanen trade. And I kind of wonder about, just changes of scenery that we mentioned. Is there a fit with Lawson Krause and Casey Middlestat that maybe opens up a winger spot for us, which heaven knows we need a winger spot opened up. We've got a 3-man rotation on the NHL squad, and in Tucson, they just reassigned a top prospect in Mikko Matica down to the ECHL because they're chock full of players down there in Tucson with Yamamoto down there. I just ran the numbers. the top 5 scorers in Tucson. Okay, this is the top minor league affiliate for a team that's in the middle of a rebuild that's been drafting high and stocking the cupboards, drafting such volume. The average age of their top 5 scorers in Tucson is 28 years old. It's older than the Utah team.
Wow.
I mean, they need to get some spots cleared up down there, in my opinion. This has got to happen quick because we can't have Julian Lutz and Miko Matica, who are like a part of the future, hopefully, not playing, not scoring, not producing, not getting opportunities, and going down to wherever the ECHL team is. I'll be honest, I'm a diehard. I'm on a Utah Hockey Club podcast, and I don't even know. So point being is just changing scenery and shifting from wing to center, make it more appealing, even if it's not your perfect center.
I think it's telling that Casey Middlestad is available when Colorado's biggest need since Kadri left has been a second line center, and they're putting him on the table, which to me that means he's shown in Colorado that he's not a second line center. So if we're going to make this trade, I'd rather just pay the full price to fully address the problem rather than get maybe a half measure or a dice roll that's not necessarily going to work, and then we got to start all over again and give up even more assets to get a real solution.
Well, Corey, I was hoping you were going to challenge me on the fact that dealing Krause for Middlestat makes us too small and soft, because then I was just going to suggest Michelli for Frederick to solve that problem. But now I'm not going to get the chance because you sold me, and I agree. The half measure is probably not the way to go on this. We've got Logan Cooley, who looks like a number 1 center of the future. We've got Barrett Hayton, that looks like a really good number 3 center of the future. I don't see that number 2 guy in the system. I hope it's Cole Beaudoin, but I think he's more of a 3C. That remains to be seen.
Speaking of Barrett Hayton, I do think that is maybe a conversation that we can have in a couple more weeks here. He's been absolutely phenomenal over the course of the past month or so. That is what you want to see in a 2C. Unfortunately, the first couple months of the season, that is not how he was playing, and I think that's a major reason why we're talking about this potential upgrade. Another reason why we're talking about this too is last year it felt, even though we had Hayton out of the lineup for so long, that we may have found that nice 3C piece in Nick Bukestad, and it just really has not worked out this season. He seems to have lost a little bit of a step, seems to have lost a little bit of kind of that first instinct is just slightly off, it seems. And again, it kind of goes into that idea of right now we're walking into next year with Cooley, Hayton down the middle. McBain obviously can play center, and Stenlin, but McBain's maybe more of a winger at this point. And Hayton is maybe more of a 3C than a 2C. And again, that's why we're bringing it up. So I think if this team is looking to make an upgrade during the deadline, I actually think it's going to be something that could happen in the offseason. So let's talk about the offseason. So we brought up some center ideas. Braden Shen, who may be a little bit older, but the price range is probably a little bit more easier to swallow than somebody like a Dylan Cousins for maybe a shorter term solution. And then you kind of hope that Cole Beaudoin can kind of take that over down the road. But bigger names like Dylan Cousins, again, that could be something where at draft time, this could be kind of a move, maybe move back in the draft, pick up some picks, send them over to Buffalo, package it with some players, or just find a way to make that upgrade work. But obviously in the offseason, there's other options as well. And the big one would be with restricted free agents. So players who either sign with the team that has drafted them because they are not unrestricted UFA free agents yet, or they have the option to be traded, or the ever so rare offer sheet, which last summer we saw 2 of when the St. Louis Blues offer sheeted Dylan Holloway and Broberg from the Edmonton Oilers. And before the show, the Clean Hits crew were talking about some upcoming RFA names that could be kind of interesting for this team.
All right.
3 really stood out to us, and I'm going to bring them up in maybe least likely to most likely order. And that would be Marco Rossi, who is playing center for the Minnesota Wild. Matthew Nyes, Arizona product, power forward, playing on the top line for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And Hofer, who is the tall goaltending, graduated from a prospect, but still young enough to where there's some upside there. Goaltender for the St. Louis Blues. And all three of these teams, well, especially Minnesota and the Maple Leafs, maybe in some cap situations to make it difficult to sign these players if they were to get offer sheeted for an amount that is higher than they can afford. Let's start with Marco Rossi. And again, I think this is probably the least likely, but he has connections with Andre Tournier. He fills the most needed position in the lineup, albeit he plays a little bit like Logan Cooley, where he's, on the smaller end of the center scale, and definitely is kind of in that playmaking realm. But Minnesota is finally going to start crawling their way out of the cap hell they made for themselves when they signed both Ryan Suter and Zach Parise way back in the 1900s. Those two contracts are finally coming off the books for them, and that should lighten the load and the ability to make some moves. But of course, as soon as those two names come off, Kirill Kaprizov needs a new contract. So do they feel like they can pay Rossi an amount that they can tolerate, knowing that he's still somewhat of an unknown? Or could a team go in there, make an offer that Rossi can't refuse, and make one that the Minnesota Wild cannot match? What do you guys think here?
Yeah, I think you'd have to go, $9.5 million, basically whatever we're going to give Logan Cooley, give that contract very similar to Marco Rossi, make things a little bit uncomfortable for Minnesota. It's been shown in the past from their beat reporter there, Michael Russo, where Minnesota would prefer to do more of a short-term deal here with Marco Rossi, just to be sure they know what they're getting here. So we'd have to go long-term and a lot of money to make Minnesota maybe think their options through here. And just one more comment on Marco Rossi. I don't remember the quote verbatim, but essentially it was when Andre Tournier was Marco Rossi's coach for the Ottawa 67s in the OHL. It was essentially Marco Rossi is the most perfect hockey player ever.
Yeah.
He does everything well.
Yep. That's what he said. Yeah. Most perfect player I've ever coached. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And short like Cooley, but probably about as wide as he is tall. So like he's the Max Domi fire hydrant build.
Yes. Yep. And one thing I do want to just kind of do a side comment here with an offer sheet. If that player accepts the offer that the other team makes, so if Utah sent $9.5 million to Marco Rossi and Minnesota could not match that or decides not to, they get compensated in draft picks, and it has to be that team's own draft pick. So if the compensation is a first and a second and or like 3 seconds or something, those would have to be Utah's. It wouldn't be that they could use any of the seconds that they have amassed over the past couple seasons. So, and obviously the higher the price, the more draft picks that need to be sent for that compensation. I don't have it pulled up. If somebody does, they can kind of break that down as we talk through these players. But I don't want to spend too much time on Marco Rossi because I think that is a huge long shot. But I think it kind of sets up the idea of both that need for a center, kind of those options that the team could pursue. Let's move on to Matty Nyes.
I've got a surprise entry, right? My latest surprise entry when it comes to centers, young centers like Marco Rossi. Now we'd have to pay him a boatload of money to get him to sign, and a lot to get Minnesota not to match. Probably as much or maybe more than Logan Cooley. And I don't know how much sense that makes. It seems a little wacky to give him more than Cooley. And I think Minnesota might match anyway. So as much as I'd love to add Rossi, I don't know if I see it. I'm with you on that, Brad. But there's another very young center who's also a pending RFA who's not doing so hot.
And East or West Conference?
I'm thinking West, and I'm talking about Trevor Zegras' teammate, Mason McTavish.
Oh.
Mason McTavish with the Ducks. I don't know if Pat Verbeek is going to accept, getting offer sheeted, or if that's a hill he's going to die on. But it seems like McTavish has been having some issues in Anaheim, being a reliable performer. I think he's been playing center, right, Brad, for the most part, or no?
Yes, he has.
Yeah. And he is a pending RFA, is he not? I believe he is.
I will need to check that, but he is a name I've had circled too when this conversation comes up, and one that I would love to see. I think he is kind of getting buried on a Anaheim team and has been playing on the third line quite a bit. I do think he gets top unit power play minutes at least, but man, that's an interesting player. He is an upcoming RFA. Now, the situation here is the Ducks have plenty of cap space to make it work. So I think if you were to offer sheet Mason McTavish, is a big factor would be if the organization has soured on him so much that they feel it's best just to part ways, get the draft picks, and then either use those to draft more and more prospects, or potentially use those to start making moves for roster players to start improving the team and starting to kind of make that switch. Their center depth is pretty decent with Leo Carlson up at the top, Ryan Strome as their kind of vet presence, and then Mason McTavish is kind of there at the third line.
Well, do we just? I don't necessarily think that we would have to pay him a boatload of money to avoid Anaheim matching. I just think that we'd have to beat the comparables, right? Because Anaheim, to keep this guy around, is not going to sign him to a ludicrous deal when the comps don't match. So if we get to the point where Anaheim says, "Well, I wouldn't sign him to that," but we take the risk on him, I don't think it's going to have to be ridiculous money. I know he's a high draft pick, but it'd be interesting to see, if we offered him, God, I don't have any comps up right now, but if we offered him 7, would Anaheim say, yeah, we're doing that all day with the rising cap? Or would they say, well, I mean, your play hasn't, I mean, we were thinking 5.5, 6.5, right? Maybe there is a play there. That's an interesting thought.
Here's
now,
the other
he's
thought.
He's not the only recent example of a struggling third overall pick center to get offer sheeted. And in that example, it wasn't matched, and he did change teams, and that was Jesperi Kotkaniemi, and that hasn't worked out. But that doesn't mean the concept doesn't work. That particular opportunity didn't pan out, but the framework is there. There's some precedent.
Also,
and go ahead.
Don't forget, Anaheim's going to be drafting high this year. It's not like they're going to be not in a spot to pick a future 2C here. I mean,
a lot of centers up there. A lot of centers up there.
Yep. They could be
Roger
looking
McQueen,
at these guys and go,
Michael Misa, James Higgins, Caleb Desnoyers. There's a bunch of centers up there. Yep.
Wow.
Frondell. Yep.
And with the way they went with Bennett Seneca last year in the draft and kind of surprised everybody, this may be one of those situations where it's a little bit like Buffalo, where that first part of the rebuild isn't really working. Detroit kind of was this way too before Yzerman came back, and you just start wiping your hands clean of those first couple picks you made at the start of a rebuild, and take the picks that you get for an offer sheet, flip those for some pieces that can help the roster now and help supplement those kids as they come up with the Senecas and whoever they draft this season. It's not out of this realm to think about.
Yeah. And also, he much, 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 much more closely aligns with the player profile that we would expect Bill Armstrong to target, rather than Trevor Zegras, or Middlestat. Yes.
Yeah. I Googled him and I had to quickly close the browser. He's a scary looking dude. He stares through you. It's pretty intimidating. He's I love that idea, Trent. Like, see, this is why I think people would pay to see what we talk about behind the scenes. It's ridiculous. We just sit here and banter left and right all the time. You know, like it's something that we get on the podcast and we're like, oh, we're going to start by this time, and we ended up starting like 45 minutes later just because we're sitting here storming up ideas. So, but this is one of those thoughts where initially you say, I would have never thought of him. And then the more and more we talk about it, the more it makes sense. So I do love the idea of McTavish. And I'm about to go trade for him in NHL 25 right now. So no, I just I love the idea. But I think unless there's another name coming up, I think the most realistic option that we've gotten so far, and that came from Corey, and I love the idea, is Joel Hofer out of St. Louis. And we were joking a little bit about this before the podcast started, but so you'll remember this was the summer of offer sheets, and Doug Armstrong, currently the general manager of Joel Hofer.
Not related to Bill Armstrong, by the way.
You're right. Obviously, Doug Armstrong was Bill Armstrong's mentor in St. Louis, and heavily the reason why Bill Armstrong is a general manager now. But Doug Armstrong famously offer sheeted the Edmonton Oilers for Broberg and Holloway. Well, it came out later, and I forget which podcast, Corey, you might have to refresh my memory, but they were talking about it, but they were at some kind of event, whether it was a golf event or a hockey event. But Doug Armstrong and Ken Holland, the Edmonton Oilers GM, were actually rooming together at the time of the offer sheets. So you can only imagine what that conversation was like. They're sitting on those twin beds with their feet up with a glass of whiskey and saying, it'd be hilarious if I offer sheeted both of your players. And he's like, that would be crazy. And then the next thing you know, both of his teams both those players were offer sheeted. So I think it would be hilarious. And I think of all people to be able to get Doug Armstrong back, and it would be kind of almost like a tongue in cheek and almost well-deserved, Bill Armstrong, because Doug Armstrong did say in the press conference, hey, I would offer sheet my own mother. It's only to make my team better. I think it would be amazing if Bill Armstrong offer sheeted Doug Armstrong, and when asked about, well, didn't you guys have a close relationship in St. Louis? He just responded back with, well, I would offer sheet my own mother. And It would just put a nice little bow on that entire situation. But I know I've been long-winded here. I'm just curious to know, as a player himself, would you guys take a risk on Hofer just due to the fact he's got tremendous upside, and St. Louis might be married to Binnington for a while?
Yeah, not only tremendous upside, but tremendous height too, right?
Yeah.
Big goalie, drafted by Bill Armstrong when he was in St. Louis. And we know that Bill's been sniffing around for this young goalie forever, right? Started with Thatcher Demko and Jeremy Swayman in the OEL trade negotiations. Spencer Knight's name was brought up for Jacob Chychrun as recently as last offseason with Yaroslav Askarov out of Nashville before he went to San Jose. So maybe he'll finally strike gold and get Joel Hofer out of St. Louis.
And one of the reasons why this could potentially happen is like Kenny mentioned, Binnington is signed for 2 more seasons after this year at $6 million. If Hofer needs a new contract and is looking for something similar to Vejmelka in the 4s, now you're talking about another team like Florida that's paying $10+ million. Well, Florida's at $14 million, but now this would be a team that's paying $10+ million for their goaltending tandem. And this is a retool team. I don't think they're quite ready to say they're going to be winning yet. They have some kids that are going to start coming up through the ranks here. They may want those picks to be able to take a couple more dart throws at some other players to kind of amass what the second wave of the St. Louis Blues is going to look like. So I think that is a very interesting option for Utah Hockey Club's goaltending in the future, especially to kind of bridge the gap between this Vejmelka Ingram era to the Rabel era, which could be a whiles away, especially before Rabel really kind of gets comfortable with the NHL. If, goalies are voodoo, he even makes it this far. But Interesting names.
I'm pretty sold on Hofer, and you know who sold me on him? Bill Armstrong. Bill Armstrong sold me on him. I was listening to interviews with Bill Armstrong in his early days of being named GM, and he was talking about his scouting philosophy when it came to goalies because they're voodoo. And he talked about what he looked for in goalies that he drafted, and he sang the praises of Joel Hofer up and down. He talked about not only the physical tools, but needing to see a guy who can put a team on his back in a big game and steal a game the team didn't deserve to win. And once a goalie can do that, he's on Bill Armstrong's radar forever. As Bill Armstrong said, we saw Joel Hofer do that not only in the WHL, but later in the AHL in the playoffs, where he came up huge for his AHL club in the Calder Cup playoffs. He's playing very well on a team in St. Louis where even Binnington himself isn't putting up great stats. So I think this is a really good potential bridge, as you mentioned, to Robble. And I think if we offer sheeted him at just over $4 million, just under the threshold that it would require to give up a first and a third, it would require only that we give up a second round pick. And I think that as much as St. Louis would rather have Joel Hofer than a second round pick, I do wonder if 4.1 million is enough of a gut punch that the second round pick suddenly starts to look a little bit better.
Yeah, and if they were looking to trade Joel Hofer outright, like, would anyone offer up a second round pick? And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Ian Cole, if you can get a pick for him. So St. Louis is a team, a bit of a, what do you want to call it? Rebuild on the fly, right?
Retool, yeah.
Yeah, retool. So move out Hofer, get the second round pick, use the second round pick to get something else, and then they can just replace him with Colton Ellis, one of their other young goalie prospects who's shown in Springfield in the AHL this year that he's pretty close to NHL ready.
Interesting stuff. The other name that we brought up was Matthew Nyes, again, power forward, Toronto. Toronto has to re-sign Marner. Would fit a BA team like a glove. And man, it would be interesting to see a world where, maybe one of our current power forwards is moved for an upgrade at center, and we just go ahead and offer sheet an up-and-coming power forward from another team who wouldn't be able to afford him. I don't want to get too much into the weeds there either, because there's a lot of moving parts there. I would say that the Maple Leafs may be one of the least defined teams going into this offseason, between what they could do with Tavares, what they want to do with Marner, if they get bounced in the first round yet again. All these question marks will probably dictate what way they go and if they even allow Matty Nyes to get anywhere near an offer sheet. Now, the other way you can add to your roster in the offseason is through the unrestricted free agents. And let's just kind of talk about a couple names that we were talking about before the show real quickly. Obviously, it's only February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. So we don't need to go too far into players that may or may not even be around once UFA period hits. And that's not until July anyways. But just to give you an idea of how this team could kind of shape their roster, three names we pointed out were Aiden Hill, goaltender of the Vegas Golden Knights, once in Arizona Coyotes. Member who was moved to the San Jose Sharks for, one of BA's first moves when he started just gutting this team. And the return, I think we were all just blown away by, and little did we know he would win a cup just 2 more seasons after. Nikolai Ehlers from the Winnipeg Jets, fantastic winger, big. He's kind of like a Mikko Rantanen light, if you will. And then maybe my favorite, Mr. Sam Bennett, the big, mean 2C for the Florida Ice Cats, Florida Panthers. Another player who would just fit like a glove for the type of team that bleeds for their own team. I think Sam Bennett may be my favorite potential UFA. He will obviously have some miles on him, having won the Cup last year, made it to the Cup finals the year before. The funny thing with Sam Bennett is he's never produced 50 points, but he brings so many more elements to his game. Great two-way play, snarl, hits hard, imposing, does not make it easy to play against your team. And I think that would really help with especially some of the younger wingers we have coming up, and the Danilo Boots and Tisha Ginlas. Thoughts on these three players, guys?
Yeah, I think you're bang on there. And Sam Bennett, talking about the miles, really like the player, but I'd rather find the next Sam Bennett than pay for the current one who's about to enter the downside of his career here. And it's going to be a very expensive downside too, going into unrestricted free agency and a rising cap.
I agree.
Yeah.
Sam Bennett is one of my favorite players in the league, but it seems like the next team to sign him will be the next team to buy him out. I expect that is how his next contract will end, is with a buyout, and that's going to coincide with exactly the time that this team is looking to compete for a cup. Just when you'd want a prime Sam Bennett on your roster, you'll have an over-the-hill one that you've got to buy out, and you won't be able to afford the one that you do need for your cup run.
Agreed. And I think that is ultimately the unfortunate paradox with Sam Bennett. You can get him for free if he makes it to UFA. But then there's a lot of things that don't fit in the team makeup. Another player, though, from Florida, which could be an option that gets shaken loose if Florida were to want to keep the band together and re-sign Sam Bennett and Aaron Ekblad, would be Anton Lundell, who I thought had a phenomenal game in the absolute drubbing that Team Finland took from Team US. I thought outside of Barkov, he was maybe the second best, if not the best player for the team last night. There's a world where the Panthers need to sign Ekblad, they need to sign Bennett, they need roster spots, and maybe getting a guy like Krause and Michelli, who are on the cheaper end of kind of where the cap is going, could be enticing enough to shake somebody like Lundell free. Again, I highly doubt it. I remember when Jacob Chikrin rumors were around, Lundell was the name that kept on coming up. And, you know, the Florida Panthers at that time seemingly needed defensemen, and they wouldn't bite then. So I just find that a little bit hard to believe, but that's probably the top of my wish list for a younger center.
Me too. Yeah, right at the top of my list as well, 100%. And yeah, man, I mean, if we can, I'll retain half on Krause. Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Let's make it happen. You want to see if you can rehab Michelli too? They've got so many great goal scorers on that roster. You want to add a little playmaker, a little countryman of Sasha Barkov, another Finlander to make up for the loss of Lundell. You've got it. You can have him too. You want to start looking at some of our defense, some of those young defensemen outside of the very top end. We can talk about those guys too. I am ready to be a very accommodating trade partner with those guys and start wheeling and dealing and getting creative if the outcome is a realistic shot at Lundell.
Yep.
Yeah.
But any other names you guys kind of want to bring up here before we kind of recap it? And
I would just go back to Trent Frederick as one other name.
Yes.
I think even if we're not making the playoffs, he's unrestricted free agent. I think there is value in bringing him in if the price is right before the deadline. Sell him on Utah, and I think he's a wing at this point in his career. But you could put him on the fourth line with Stenlund and potentially Jack McBain, and just have three guys who could go out there for 10 minutes, cause havoc, and just be a total pain to play against. And that's reminiscent of the team that Bill Armstrong had in St. Louis, with guys like, who was that?
Chris Stewart.
The fourth line they had.
Chris
Stewart.
It
was just irritating to play against.
Man.
Yes.
I think of McBain. I think of McBain, Stenlund, and Frederick. Like I think of those LA Kings fourth lines when they were winning cups. And King and
Oh my gosh.
Islanders too, right? With Matt Martin and who else did they have? Those are the best fourth line.
Clutterbuck and
multiple years. Yes,
Cizikas and Clutterbuck and Martin. Yeah. Man, that would be unreal. I'd probably overpay for Frederick too, against my better judgment, just because I'm a fan first and foremost, and that is a fourth line I want to watch play every night.
Just take the second from Ian Cole and flip it for Trent Frederick and give him an extension, and then you got potentially the best fourth line in the division, the Western Conference, the league, and go from there. Just guys who can
Yep.
look at for 10 minutes and change the pace of the game rather than just kill clock.
And all
I'll
three
be
of them
honest,
can play
and
up a line
nobody.
if needed.
Yes, that's true. And I'll be honest, and nobody's going to like this, but I'd probably trade Michelli for him.
I mean, again, I think one thing I want to make clear here, it's not that we dislike Michelli's. It's not like we dislike Krause's. I also believe that both of these
100%.
players may be having the worst season that they will have for the primes of their careers. I think
True.
both of these players are in very nice spots to bounce back, increase their point and goal totals next season. But at
True.
one point here, it's just a matter of you have only so many roster spots, and you want to make sure that those roster spots are utilized in the best way possible. So if having a guy like Frederick bring an element of play that we just don't have enough of, and you have to move a guy like Michelli, where we have great playmakers in Cooley, Keller, Schmaltz, and he's kind of the guy who just doesn't get the top power play time because of it. Yes, I think you do those types of moves to get a better balance on the team. And man, Michelli setting up Pasta could be
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. That's another point here.
About.
Yes, that's another good point here, Brad. Is like, yeah, I want to echo that. I definitely am not anti-Michelli and Krause. It's just at a certain point when guys are struggling, you might look to do a change of scenery, and not just because you're heartless and you want to wheel and deal and improve the team at all costs. Sometimes those guys welcome the change, man. It's the change of scenery is not just for the scenery they leave behind, but the one they're heading to, right? So the concept of maybe doing a deal where they go to a place like Florida or a place like Boston, it's not as though that's a slap in the face. That's just another opportunity for everybody involved. So I think that's a really good clarifying point that I don't want anyone to misconstrue that we're somehow against these players. Hey, we bleed blue, baby, and they are Utah hockey clubbers, future mammoths, and sometimes the best trades are the ones you don't make. And if they hang on to both and each one of them bounce back to 20 goal mark for Krause, 60 point mark for Michelli, then we're going to look absolutely brilliant as a Utah Hockey Club for hanging on to them, and absolutely stupid as a Utah Hockey Club podcast for speculating about it so much. So that would be just fine by me.
Agreed. Well, just to sum it up again, buying and selling time. I think if the Utah Hockey Club are sellers, we're probably going to be seeing small things, small moves like the Ian Coles, the Nick Bukestads, Alexander Kerfoots, or Michael Carcones, the guys who are unrestricted free agents and can walk next season. If they are buyers around the trade deadline, I really highly doubt they're going to get rentals, aka guys who will be unrestricted free agents. I think they will be looking for long-term pieces. So some names we threw out there were Braden Shen and Dylan Cousins, kind of upgrades at centers. And if we are upgrading in that capacity, whether it's at the deadline or in the offseason, it may take bigger pieces like Lawson Krause's, Matthias Michelli's, Michael Kesselring's, maybe Mavic Lamara's, those types of pieces that are premium and can bring a premium return back to the team. And then, of course, this offseason, there are other avenues such as offer sheets, unrestricted free agency, and, of course, moving draft picks when they are the most valuable during draft time in order to make those upgrades. And of course, I think by May, we are going to be talking about that nonstop, because after the blockbuster of an offseason that this team had last year with general manager Bill Armstrong at the helm, I have a feeling we're going to see some more fireworks this offseason. Well, that is a nice long discussion to hopefully keep you entertained and get all of those Utah Hockey Club itches scratched while we wait for games to resume on February 22nd. Enjoy the Four Nations face-off. Again, if you guys want to help support the podcast, make sure you're liking, subscribing, commenting. Feel free to become one of those members where you get the cool badges and access to some of the VIP areas of our Discord. Maybe join Team Mammoth, the Mammoth Club itself, by picking up a shirt at shop.cleanhitshockey.com. Subscribe to our blog at cleanhitshockey.com. However you want to support us, we will gladly take it. Also, want to give some shout outs to SLC Puck. I mean, if you are not following this guy, what are you doing? One of the most entertaining shows around the team. And then I do want to give a little tip of the cap to the Puck Drop. They just had Mr. Fleury himself on the show, and that was a really entertaining interview. I am Brad. This is Corey. This is Trent. Kenny actually snuck off, if you weren't watching the YouTube videos, probably to get those Valentine's Day gifts. Give your loved ones a big hug today. If you're watching this tomorrow, do it again anyways. And I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. We will catch you next time. Adios.
We know we running it now. Watch the game change.